I want to talk a bit about story as theory of change. And this is something that I started to investigate about 3-4 years ago when a guy named Jonas Sachs did a presentation at South by Southwest that I was really impressed with. He's the author of something called The Story Wars. And if you get a chance, I recommend this book to any activist. Amazing analysis of how story works in the human brain, in human society, and in organizations. And he's written it as a marketing handbook for companies that are trying to do good in the world. But it's Jonah has worked with activists for years and years and years. He worked with Annie Leonard, who did The Story of Stuff, Greenpeace, just about every organization in the United States working for animal rights, human rights, or social justice. And he took us on a journey that was not just about story as a good way to, how to tell a good story, but something much, much deeper in the human psyche. And this goes into an area of psychological evolution, behavioral psychology. There are dozens and dozens of books on this that I find absolutely fascinating. I'll just give you a glimpse of some of this. But it makes the case that stories are the foundation of human society. They're how we began to become the dominant species on the planet. And it started with our ability to understand intent. And this is a differentiator from us, from the animal world, is that we could sit down together as a tribe and suddenly decide we're going to make this cave a home, or we're going to go and hunt together. And that understanding of intent suddenly meant that we could work as a unit. You know, we're not a pack animal like the wolf is that naturally falls into packs. But we learned how to understand each other's intent. And that meant we started to create groupings that divided labor and did things like say, okay, somebody has to keep the fire going while we go out and gather berries. So there was a division of labor. Everybody had to play their part to make the unit work. And stories became a way of guarding against what's called the cheat in a society. The society works fine if everyone does what they're supposed to do. But if somebody doesn't do what they're supposed to do and just takes the benefit, then there's a problem. And story became a way of saying, all right, let's talk about the time that Alessandro fell asleep and the fire went out. That was pretty bad. You know, we were cold for 3 days. And how does that feel to you, Alessandro, when you get told that you fell asleep around the fire?
Ti sei addormentato e hai lasciato che si spegnesse il fuoco nella caverna e tu eri la persona preposta a controllare il fuoco e per 3 giorni sono morti tutti di freddo.
Just a little bit desperate.
It feels bad. It feels really bad to be the target of that story. You don't want to be, none of us want to be like Alessandro because, yeah, that was terrible.
I feel a bit alone.
Yeah, you feel isolated. You cut off from the group. And this is the intent of that story, is to say, don't do what he did because you might feel like he feels. You might get cut off from the group. You might lose the benefit of being a part of this tribe. But if we say, remember the time that Paula went out into the woods and she found that amazing wood that burned for 3 days, and she went out in the cold and kept us alive for 3 nights. That was amazing. And how does that make you feel? Exactly! You're a superhero. And we all want to be just like Paula. It's a way of reinforcing the behavior that helps the tribe, that helps the species, that helps us move forward. Because we all want to emulate her. And it's a very tricky mental thing that happens there where you put yourself in Paula's shoes or Alessandro's shoes. through empathy. You see yourself, you imagine yourself as part of that story. And that's what brings the lesson home to your heart, is you think, what would it be like if I were in their position? So these kind of stories helped us to live together, but they also helped us to survive in very real ways. And there's a reason everyone in this room is an incredible storyteller. And that's because you've been evolutionarily selected. Mikabishi. Yeah? Evolutionary selection? Okay. People who understood how to tell stories and how to recognize the lessons in stories were the ones who survived. Let me tell you about the time that a bear was coming after me in the woods, and I managed to get away. You feel your brain light up? You're like, pay attention. This might be a lesson that I could use in the future. So sometime, if I'm walking in the woods and I see a bear, I'm going to go, whoa, what was that story about how somebody got away from a bear? And we shared those stories among us, and we learned to survive. And the one who didn't pay attention to the story got eaten by the bear. They didn't continue. And the ones who told the story got treated like Paula in the woods with the fire. They were like, that's heroic. You've given us a way to survive. You've given us a piece of information that's useful for us in surviving.
But the problem is that often we read stories written by bears. So we need to read other stories and to tell other stories.
Yes, exactly. And that's where the story wars come in. And it's very much a war of stories today. And there are a lot of bears writing stories. There are a lot of bears with a lot of money writing stories. There are a lot of bears who don't want any change in the world writing stories. So at another level, though, there were the stories that were providing meaning. And these were the stories that provided a sense of why human beings were here. And this might have been the volcano god. The volcano god created our island by throwing fire into the air and dropping it into the water. Stories that created a sense of purpose for the human race, or purpose for individual lives. And all of those help us to make sense of the world, but there are also stories that change with time. And they operate at the level of mythology. And we like to think of mythology sometimes as something the ancient Greeks did. You know, we don't do mythology today. Mythology is dead, it's long gone. No, 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 no. There are myths that surround us every day and govern our lives, govern our behaviors, and govern the way we think. And we just don't see them as stories. They are stories. A good example of that would be the days of the week. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. They don't exist in nature. You know, monkeys aren't happy on Friday. Giraffes don't get the Monday blues. It's a complete human construction. We tell each other. It's a story we share to organize our lives. And if you think about what your sense of the possible is on a Monday versus your sense of the possible on a Friday, it shapes your behavior in a very, very deep way. There's things you will not do on a Friday that you will do on a Wednesday, that you won't do on a Monday or a Sunday. And it's a complete story. It's a commonly held story. But stories of superhuman things will also change our sense of what's possible. And I love this example. This is a baseball bat. You know, the batter accidentally released it. It flew into the crowds. This guy catches it, saved him from a fractured skull, and didn't spill his beer. So he became a hero on Reddit, not so much for saving the guy from the fractured skull, but because he didn't spill his beer. But it's a humorous example, but it's a really important point, is that when we hear stories, real stories, true stories of human beings do amazing things to help each other or to save one another, or exceeding our expectations of what humans are capable of, it changes our entire idea of what human beings are capable of. So they shape our behavior in a fundamental way. So why is this important to activism? Well, if you think of activism as changing human behavior with the promise that a better world is possible and turning that behavior into a norm, that's storytelling. That is storytelling. That is stories that take an unusual thing and turn it into something that's expected, something that's normal. And, but most importantly, that change human behavior. Because the story is important, but it's the change in human behavior, which is actually what all of us are interested in as digital activists. Actual change. So if we look at thinking about story as the operating system of the human mind, and the operating system of society, and the operating system of organizations, then what does every hacker know about an operating system? It can be hacked. You can get in there and mess with the basics of it. So when Jonas Sachs started talking about mythology and the role of mythology in society, he was talking about how we could change a fundamental story level of how we behave and how we think the world should behave. And this is a bit about myth. And myth is something that provides an explanation of the world. It gives meaning to our lives. It provides a story that we can live out, and it gives you rituals. So if you take the Catholic Church, explanation is God created the world. The meaning in your life is if you are good, you're going to go to heaven. Your story is that you are trying to not sin, you're trying to be good, and the ritual is you're going to confession every Friday, every day, if you're serious, every Sunday, and confessing your sins. So there's a ritual, there's an explanation, meaning. But another example of a myth that's not a religious myth would be the American dream. And this is everybody familiar with this term? I apologize, it's an Americanism, and I'm an American, but it's the one that I know the best because I grew up with a father who grew up in the American dream in the 1950s. And the American dream was, if you work hard, you will become rich. That's it, basically. There's equal opportunity for everybody. The explanation was, everybody's created equal. This is the US Constitution says all men are created equal. Everybody has the same opportunity for success. The meaning was you do hard work. Your class, and not like those British people, your class is not going to determine whether you succeed or not. It's not whether you were born into the manor. It's how hard you work. And it's how determined you are to be of value to society that will determine if you become rich and successful and respected by your neighbors. And this is the reason that you have all these rags to riches stories in the United States. You know, the guy who's selling newspapers on the corner and then eventually is owning the newspaper. Yeah? And the ritual was what I saw my father do every day. A daily commute into work, wearing the funny hat and the tie and the suit. All those rituals were absolutely essential to the American dream. You couldn't wear a tie-dyed shirt and a baseball cap backwards in 1950 and expect to get the American dream. You had to be part of the ritual. Well, that myth started to decay in 2008 when the economic crisis hit the US. And suddenly, banks were foreclosing. People were losing their mortgages. But more than this, people were hearing the stories of the fact that the same banks that were foreclosing on those mortgages, that were taking people's houses, were giving their directors multi-million-dollar awards. You're like, good job, you saved the bank from collapse by making all those people lose their houses. That didn't seem like the American dream. So it introduced what's called a myth gap. And a myth gap is when the myth stops explaining the world adequately, or it's being contradicted by enough evidence that people are starting to question if it actually is true or not. And the new story that arose amazingly quickly was Occupy. And Occupy was a flawed story in that it didn't have an answer, but it was an amazingly quick definition of the problem. The 99%, who hasn't heard of the 99% in this room? Hasn't? You have. Do you know the 99%?
No.
Okay. The 99% is the idea that in the United States, 99% of the people are not making the money, and 1% of the people are making the money. The 1% are benefiting, the 99% are not. And if you look at the graphs of the income inequality over the last 10, 20 years, 99% of the people have been getting poorer, while 1% of the people are getting richer and richer and richer. And so this idea that it's an equal playing field, that America is a land of opportunity no matter where you come from, suddenly wasn't looking true. And a lot of people started to stop believing it. And both of these guys are operating in that myth gap in very, very different ways. Donald Trump is saying, it's the Mexicans, it's those foreigners coming in here, that's the problem. And Bernie Sanders is going, it's the billionaires, that's the problem. I like Bernie's explanation better. I won't be secretive about that. But they're both, if you asked anybody 4 years ago whether these two would have been viable candidates for the presidency of the United States, nobody would have said yes. They would have said, you're crazy. Are you nuts? Donald Trump? Bernie Sanders? Nah, don't have a chance. But America's going through the collapse of a myth. And that's when things get unexpected. And that's a really interesting place to operate as digital activists because they're telling new stories. Donald Trump's telling the story, I don't need the money that all the other GOP candidates are getting. I'm a billionaire. Elect me. I know how to get things done. That's the story that he's telling. He's trying to make that the new story. Bernie Sanders is trying to tell the story that, you know, we really should be behaving like almost every other country in the world and giving free education and free health care and reducing our military spending and addressing this income inequality. And he's trying to make that the new story. But this is where the story wars happen, is in that gap when myths are starting to collapse and the opportunity for a new story comes in. So if you're a good storyteller and you have a powerful story that is going to speak to people's hearts, that has a good chance of occupying that space and bringing up a new mythology. So this is where it really gets to be about changing the world, is finding those myth gaps and shifting the myth. So if stories are ancient, and this has been going on forever and ever and ever, why is storytelling now suddenly a thing? And it is a thing. I just founded a company on storytelling. I hear storytelling in the advertising world all the time. You hear people claiming that designing roller coasters is a way of storytelling. And it's like, it is and it isn't. But there's a reason, there's a legitimate reason why now is a particularly interesting and unusual time for story. And it has to do with the reason all of you are in this room as digital activists. It's not an accident. Digital. If we look at how stories used to be told, we've got a campfire here, all right? And we're all going to tell a story. And you're going to tell a story about... What do you want to tell a story about? Any? Yeah. So you ran the fastest mile you ever ran last Tuesday. And the amazing thing was, she ran faster than anybody else had ever run. You ran the 3-minute mile, right? So we're telling the story around the campfire. Does anybody want to retell that story to somebody? It's like, she ran a 3-minute mile. And she wasn't even trying. It was just practice. That's an amazing story. You want to retell it. That story would get retold if it was a good story. That was the only criteria. If it's a good story, it would be retold again and again and again and again. But that was the campfire tradition. That was the oral tradition. And you could change that story. I could say, Not only did she run that 3-minute mile, there was a bear chasing her. That's why she ran the story. She might not hear that story. It's now my story to tell because I'm telling it at another campfire far away. But it's a story that's told by a network, and somebody else will tell it and take it and go. And she was being chased by a bear, and she ran a 3-minute mile, and then she turned around and she punched the bear in the nose, and he fell flat on the ground. You know, it's the oral tradition of storytelling was embellishment, was making a good story. That was the important part. And then, so the elements of this was the best story wins. The transmission system is a web of campfires, of tribes. Everyone owns the idea. It would be impossible for Clarissa to say, hey, that story you're telling about the bear, that's not true, that's my story, and you owe me money. In a campfire tradition, you can't do that. You've told the story of the campfire, it's free, somebody can take it. So the ideas get passed on or they die. Then something happened in about maybe 1930, 1940. But we got into what's called the broadcast era, and suddenly the ways of telling stories through society was through television, through radio, through newspapers, through these vehicles that required you to pay. And if you had enough money, you could make a story go all over the world. You could create a story about a cowboy who smokes cigarettes. You could call him the Marlboro Man. And you could make people go, yeah, I'm like that cowboy. I want to smoke cigarettes like he does because he's tough and he doesn't care about cancer. And he's a cowboy.
But he didn't know.
And he's a cowboy. He didn't know. And the actor who played him actually died of cancer. But that's a story that, you know, it doesn't require any of us to retell it because you just put the money in for the advertising, you tell the story in television, you tell the story in magazines, you tell the story in newspapers, and suddenly the whole world knows about the Marlboro Man, you know? Off it goes. But the transmission is one to many. They own the Marlboro Man. Don't you dare go telling a story about the Marlboro Man punching a bear without paying them money. The idea is theirs. They own it. It's property. It's a commodity. And they will be paid in exchange for telling that story. And it doesn't rely on audience participation. It helps if it's got audience participation. But in the days of television, it didn't matter. That ad would still be on the 6 o'clock news, regardless of whether anybody talked about it or not. So the question is, what came after that? Well, what came after that is the place where all of you are playing right now. And that's the digital era, or the digitoral era, as Jonah calls it. And this is a bit of a return back to the principles of the campfire. Suddenly, you know, the stories that win are the stories that are the best, regardless of how much money they have. I'm going to put a bucket of ice water over my head and put it on YouTube. It's going to cost no money at all, and I'm going to watch it go viral across the world. The transmission is a web. That story dies if I put a bucket of ice water on my head and nobody takes it and shares it. It's gone. It's over. Everyone owns the ideas, and the ideas get passed on or they die. Now, I personally believe that what we're witnessing with the rise of the internet and the rise of the net is the creation of a system, a network, a nervous system for the entire planet. So synapses and nerves and reaction. And my first sort of awareness that we were getting to the point where we could coordinate movement globally was back during the Iraq War invasion, when everyone agreed to be out in the streets on March 11th, I think was the date, on the same day around the world to protest the invasion of Iraq. And you couldn't have done that before the internet. You couldn't have that quickly arranged a single date. And it's a simple logistics task. And it didn't actually end the war. But that was the beginning of a muscle being created that was also responsible for the Arab Spring, that was also responsible for Occupy in some ways. And that ability to coordinate movement around the planet in a way that suddenly the entire planet becomes connected by these by these synapses and nerves. So you're getting to the point where the nervous system is learning to react. The muscles aren't quite there, but every time that we trigger those, the system learns a little bit. And this is where my interest in the Ice Bucket Challenge wasn't just in terms of the donations, it's the exercising of that muscle, of people saying, here's a story, here's something I want to help with. I'm going to spread this story, I'm going to make this story go as far as possible. And the more stories like that that are dedicated to doing good in the world, the more that those muscles get stronger. And Arab Spring was another example. It may not have done what it needed to do, but it made an incredible muscle stronger, and it made every single dictator in the world think about turning off the internet immediately whenever there's a protest in their country. And as we saw yesterday, fire chat is one way around that. You know, there are going to be ways that the system learns to get around that attempt to shut down that network, and the network will just get stronger and stronger and stronger. So there's another thing that makes story important today, and I think it's because we are in a life-threatening situation. And when you get that moment where you see the bear around the corner, your brain starts to think about all the stories that you've heard about bears. Am I supposed to make noise? Am I supposed to meet his eyes? Am I supposed to look down? Am I supposed to cover my head? Am I supposed to run as fast as I can? You think of all the stories that you've heard. And we are currently in that life-threatening situation with climate change, the exhaustion of the resources of the earth. And so story is naturally rising to the surface as something we're all paying attention to, because we want to believe that human beings can overcome anything. We want to believe that we are the superheroes that can survive. We want to believe that we have an innate goodness that is not going to let this planet fall apart, is not going to let millions of people suffer. Everybody wants to believe that. So we're looking for the stories that confirm it. We're looking for the stories that tell us how to do that. And all of you can be building the stories that help people learn how to do that. So there's stories that hold us back, stories by bears. Here's a couple bears. These are the Koch brothers. And they are, the reaction anyone should have to the Koch brothers. They made their money as coal barons in the United States. Coal, carbone, see? And they are currently telling the story that change is impossible, that climate change isn't real, that it's being told by a bunch of people who are anti-America, anti-jobs. They are telling a story that is designed to hold people down, to hold people back, because they don't want change. They want to keep things the way they are. And they tell a very powerful story. They get people out there talking about American nationalism. They talk about jobs. And they make a very convincing case to many people in the United States right now. But there's another story going on, which is this guy. Who knows who this is? Yes, founder of Tesla, Elon Musk. Elon Musk came out of university in South Africa and didn't say, I want to make $1 billion. He said, I really want to see humanity survive. What are the 3 most important things to human survival? And he said, well, one of them is a free internet, an internet that functions well, an internet that allows commerce. So he founded PayPal. He took all the money that he got from founding PayPal. Did he buy an island on a yacht? No. He took all that money and he put it into developing the electric car. Because he said, the other 2 things that are going to be important to human survival are the ability to get off the planet, space travel, and the ability to solve our energy problem. And so he invented the electric car. He didn't invent the electric car. He created a very good electric car, very high-priced electric car, but one that changed the story of what an electric car could look like. It looked really good. It was really expensive. It was aimed at very, very rich customers. And it did change the story, because electric cars before that, it looked, you know, like hippies would drive them. And they were, you know, square, just not very attractive. But then he took the patent for that, and did he hold on to it and say, it's mine, I'm going to make $1 billion? He open sourced it, he released it, and he said, I want thousands of companies making these. I don't want to be the only one making these. If we're going to have a revolution in our energy, then the car has to stop running on oil. It has to become electric. And so he released the patent. And now he's just recently created a new electric car that's aimed at the average American customer. He sold more cars in 48 hours for a car that doesn't exist yet, a pre-order, more cars in 48 hours than anyone has ever sold in the history of the US automotive industry. He's changing the story of how cars get sold. And he's out to fix the planet doing it. He created a battery which stores solar or wind energy and runs a building. And did he hold on to it and say, I'm going to make $1 billion off this? He open sourced it again. And he told other people to go out and make it. So he's an example of a new kind of story. He's an activist entrepreneur, somebody who's doing very, very well, but using that to try to, you know, save the world. And I watched the launch of the Tesla on a live feed, and he started out with a lecture on climate change and a PowerPoint about climate change. And the marketer in me went, oh, Elon, Elon, Elon. And the activist me went, Elon! Because it was brilliant. It was absolutely great. He wasn't talking about the value of the car. He was talking about the value of buying that car as an act of environmentalism, as an act of hope for the future. This is Kumi Naidoo. He was the executive director of Greenpeace up until recently. And he tells this story about apartheid, and when he started working against apartheid as a young boy. And he was told that thing that all those other activists were told, that your cause is just, but it's impossible. You're never going to overthrow the South African regime. It's the largest military force on the African continent. We have no right to vote in order to overthrow it. That means it's going to require revolution. We have no allies outside of South Africa in overturning apartheid. And at the time they didn't. South Africa was a very powerful economic force. You're all too young to remember this, but there was a time when apartheid was defended as part of the economic engine that made South Africa strong. You didn't mess with it if you wanted to trade with South Africa. And Kumi watched that story change as he became a student and as he became an older activist. And it was partially because of stories like Nelson Mandela being tremendously courageous and going to jail for what he believed, and Stephen Biko. But it was also because of smaller stories like his teacher in school, who allowed his student group to meet in her house, despite the fact that she had to look out the door every time they arrived to make sure her neighbors weren't watching or the police weren't watching, because she could be thrown in jail just for letting them use her house to meet in. And that story started to change things. The story of people turning up when the boycott on South African goods started to happen, people starting to join that, other nations starting to join that, people beginning to show up in front of South African embassies, people beginning to be vocal about the fact that it was no longer acceptable. Celebrities stepping out and saying, I'm against South Africa's apartheid policies. Athletes stepping out and saying, I will not play football with the South African team because I don't believe it should be, apartheid should be in place. And little by little, those stories began to change people's belief of what was possible. And Kumi says it beautifully, and he's done a TED Talk where he says that it was only when people in large numbers came to believe that change was possible that change became possible. Now, how did that happen? How did all those people come to believe that change was possible? Story by story by story of people realizing that it could happen, that it was possible, that it could change. And he equates it to the situation we're in now with climate change, where you look at what needs to change in the world in order to stop climate change, and it looks impossible. It looks totally impossible. And the hope we can draw from that story is that eventually we will deal with it, and it will look inevitable that we dealt with it. We'll look back and think, how could we ever have run anything on oil and coal when we had wind and solar and sea to power our lives? It's just crazy. It's nuts. It's inevitable. So that's the nature of big change. It looks impossible when you start. It looks inevitable when you finish. And the stories that make us think that those things are inevitable are the really great stories. And they're stories not of human failure, not of human cruelty, but of human triumph, of the triumph of people's belief in each other and belief in the future that things can get better, and their willingness to do things to make that happen. So, that's the bottom line. Change the story, and we can change the world.